Welcome to a CNBC Africa special. And why do we call this a special? Because we have a panel conversation. We have two guests for you today that are going to help us break down one of the key topics of 2021. Now, if you want to be part of this conversation, you can tweet us at CNBC Africa or tag me directly at The Real Quizzer. What is our conversation about today? Our conversation is regarding illicit financial flows and how big of a problem that is for the continent. We've been talking about FDIs throughout 2021. When we are getting into 2022, could money on the continent be good for the continent or even be enough for the continent? Allow me to introduce to you our panel of experts. I will start with Mr. Alvin Mosioma. He's the Executive Director of the Tax Justice Network for Africa. Thank you for making the time. So I want to start with Everlyn. Everlyn, I want you to paint this picture for us from a policy perspective. How big of a gap do we have in ensuring that money that belongs to the continent stays on the continent?
I feel that there are several ways to answer that. At a continental level, at a regional level, as well as at a national level. At a national level, most of us do not have any laws that specifically address the issue of illicit financial flows or capital flight per se. And at a continental level, the same can also be observed. And the issue with this is, even if we have instances such as the Pandora Papers, the Mauritius leaks, and the FinCEN files, and many other leaks that have been exposed before, we don't have the existing legal framework or policies in order to make sure that the people who are behind this are brought to justice. So I can point that out as one of the very huge gaps that is there within the whole framework.
Thank you for setting the pace for us there, Evelyn. Alvin, bring you into the conversation. UN statistics, that number that we have talked about a few times, 88.6 billion of capital flight per year from Africa leaving the continent. Alvin, how big of a problem is this?
Thank you, Arnold. Thank you. And just building up on the point that Evelyn was making, I think when we look at what you can call the financing gap, the continent has set a very ambitious agenda called the Africa 2063 agenda that aims to lift the Africans out of poverty. At the same time, we have the UN Sustainable Development Goals that seek to end poverty. If you look at these goals, the estimate out there is that Africa would need at least $200 billion annually to be able to start making progress towards achieving those two very ambitious work programs that the continent has set out. At the same time, we are having 89 billion living. These are according to the UNCTAD, most recent UNCTAD studies. $89 billion leaving the continent as a result of this phenomenon of illicit financial flows. And this is the money that is living on an annual basis. We have not even started talking about the debt stock. We have not started even talking about the actual money that is already hidden there, that the continent has been struggling to bring back through the different asset recovery mechanisms. You might know the example of Abacha, the amount of money that Abacha stole, and that money is there. So it's not just the money that is living on an annual basis out of the continent, is being siphoned through different mechanisms, corruption, money laundering, illicit financial flows more generally. But it's also the money that is already existing in those tax havens that the continent is trying to bring back to be able to address this huge financial gap that we face that are undermining our efforts towards progress, our efforts towards poverty eradication, and our effort to ensure that citizens of the continent are living a life that is of dignity and on opportunity.
Evelyn, bring you back into the conversation. You hinted on something regarding policy, and I believe this is also your specialty. I just want to know and find out, when you look at, let's say, Kenya's parliament, when you look at the people that have been mentioned in some of these papers, Pandora Papers, Panama Papers, Mauritius leaks, you look at South Africa's parliament, Uganda, to mention but a few, on the continent. Policymakers are creating lots of policies around everything, but nothing on this particular subject. So what can be done to ensure that policies are set for this, but also there's accountability in the long run to keep Africa's money in Africa and to ensure that the citizens also go ahead to benefit and live that dignified life, as Alvin has put it?
So I'll start with the issue of accountability. I think as Africans, we need to start getting angry and angrier about the issue of illicit financial flows as we are about, let's say, corruption. Because when, for instance, you look at the Pandora Papers, when you look at the kind of people who are named, most of them are actually politicians. I think we had around, if I'm not wrong, 49 African politicians who are named, and this also included heads of states. So even if we look at the issue of accountability, it's also a matter of political will. And, you know, having this sort of checks and balances. And then the question arises, if these are the perpetrators of those illicit financial flows, corruption, aggressive tax avoidance, and just hiding their money offshore and in tax havens, then will they be the ones who will truly stand up and, you know, bring into account their pretty much their fellows, people whom they work with every day? So it's a strong question of political will. Other than that, I think in terms of also the parliament, I think the role of the parliament is absolutely essential when we talk about accountability and making the policy and legal framework better and stronger so that we can make sure that we aren't losing so much revenue and so much resources to illicit financial flow, as you've quoted, almost to a tune of around roughly 80 billion on an annual basis. And I think the reason for this is because the parliament, in the first instance, is a custodian of public good. It is the specific body which is supposed to act as a shield and supposed to forward public interest because they're the only arm of government that is actually directly elected. And so the first step is we need to build the technical capacity of parliamentarians. You can't have only one committee being involved in this matter. We need to enhance the capacity of parliament when it comes to understanding illicit financial flows, so that when we discuss technical issues such as double taxation agreements and how African governments keep entering into agreements with developed countries, or what we may call the global north, that are very unfavorable in terms of taxing rights, then we can have a technically competent parliament that will be able to understand this and be able to guard against what I may call our tax sovereignty, to make sure that African countries don't keep losing revenue in such manner.
Quite the optimism there, Evelyn. Alvin, it's between a rock and a hard place for citizens on the continent. You expect your policymakers to be thinking of you and setting up the right policies to give you that dignified life, but at the same time, they are the biggest beneficiaries of some of these tax havens. So, is there some form of magic bullet, silver bullet that can help solve this solution?
Unfortunately, there's no magic bullet. But I think just building up on what Everlyn was saying, I think on one side, we cannot. I think laws are very important. Having rigorous legislative frameworks that be able to, because the decisions that governments make, the decisions that international organizations make are based on the existing legislative framework. And what we see in the continent is many of the laws that we have are outdated, they are prosperous, they are providing avenue for leakages. Everlyn was mentioning, for example, the area of the double tax agreement regimes, the tax incentive regime. So really working on the laws is still critical. Even when we have good working laws, working on the laws is really, really important. That's the first. Second, And that brings the point that you are raising. Those laws, once they are in existence, they must be implemented. And implementation requires resources because those implementation is carried out by institutions such as Parliament, oversight institutions, anti-corruption bodies, the Kenya Revenue Authority, and different institutions which must be made capable to be able to implement those laws. So sometimes you have very good laws, but you don't have the necessary mechanism. The institutions that are supposed to implement those laws have not been given the adequate resources to be able to do that. That's the second. So the importance of strengthening and investing in building institutions that are responsible for implementing those laws. That's the second. And the third point, I think, is the bigger question of the political will. And that, of course, is that big elephant in the room. How do we actually push the political will? And political will must be manufactured. Political will cannot be handed on a silver platter. So there is importance of different actors to be involved. The role that the journalists have played, for example, has been very, very critical in bringing the issues of illicit financial flow to the public's discourse. The Pandora Papers, the Panama Papers, the different leaks that we have seen have significantly contributed. And this is a role of journalists that have played in terms of saying we are not just there to report, we have a responsibility to expose some of these activities. Citizens have a responsibility to play, members of parliament. So it really is a question of how do we bring the different actors to play the role that they are supposed to play to be able to manufacture or to enforce the political will that lacks in terms of the implementation.
Alvin, a few points there you've touched on, and I think we can also go ahead to dissect there. I want to stay with you for this next question and then get back to Everlyn. You've spoken about tax havens. You've spoken about things like Mauritius, Seychelles, but we're also seeing a rebrand of tax havens, for lack of a better word, and this is according to some economists or activists. And we are seeing a rise in international finance centers, this time being domiciled on the continent. Now, is this good for the continent? And if not, with some of these centers offering as low as 3%, 5% for companies to domicile, corporate companies at that, and individuals, how big of a challenge or how big of a problem does this create?
Thank you, Arnold. This is really, we are seeing this as a serious emerging problem across the continent. As you know, the idea of establishing international financial center didn't begin this year or 2 years ago. Ghana tried, I think, in the early 2000s to set up an offshore financial center with the support from Barclays. That did not work. We have seen countries such as Botswana try to set up IFCs, and the most recent ones being Kenya and Rwanda trying to set up these IFCs. If you talk to governments, what they tell you is that these IFCs are supposed to act as a one-stop shop to facilitate the flow of investment. But the gains or the benefits that are expected out of these international financial centers, I think they are overestimated. On the other side, on the contrary, however, the risks that they pose, not just the economies of those countries, but the economies of the region is really, really serious. And that's why we at the Tax Justice Network Africa have been working with other civil society organizations to try and confront this problem and to try and challenge the effort to creating offshore financial centers in the region. The negative aspect we feel outweighs whatever positive benefits that you can be able to gain out of setting up an international financial center. One, of course, they create a very uneven playing field between foreign investors who are coming in and registering through the international financial centers versus domestic businesses that are not enjoying those benefits. So you find that you are creating an uneven competition between domestic and international investors. Secondly, we see, for example, for countries such as Kenya that are surrounded with very unstable neighbors. You look at Somalia, you look at DRC. Poorly regulated international financial centers can become a magnet for dirty money. And we have seen this in the case of Dubai, where scandals after scandals, these were revealed in the Panama Papers, they were revealed in the Pandora Papers about how Dubai has become a haven as a tax haven, as an international financial center for the laundering of mineral resources from DRC. So it became like a laundering hub for the region, causing huge instability from the economy across the different regions. That's why we feel that we are not opposed to the effort to attract foreign direct investment. I think governments should be able to create an enabling environment that attracts investment into the region, into the East Africa region, but that it's international financial centers is not the way to go. They need to invest in infrastructure. They need to invest in reliable energy. They need to invest in building an available workforce. These are the issues that investors look at when they are determining the destination for their investment. It's not taxation, or is not the kind of preferential treatment that these international financial centers have. And lastly, I think they are undermining regional integration, particularly in the case of Kenya and Rwanda. You have a region that is moving towards establishing a common market area, trying to create a political union, but at the same time, these countries in their own are establishing these centers that are, in terms of the legal framework, are very different and can undermine the effort for creating this political union that the East Africa regions are heading towards, and also being the disadvantage of other countries that don't have that in Tanzania, in Uganda. So what are we going to do? Are we going to ask also Uganda to also set up an IFC and Tanzania to set up an IFC? That is not, I think, in our own assessment as Tax Justice Network Africa, is both politically, economically, the wrong direction to go.
Everlyn, is it possible to set up an IFC while at the same time not being a tax haven?
I think you mentioned it very well when you spoke of the rebranding of tax havens using the name International Financial Centers. In some circles, actually, some believe that international financial centers are just a legitimate way of actually introducing tax havens into the country. For instance, when you look at well-known tax havens, such as Mauritius, they do have an international financial center. The same thing with Dubai, which Alvin just mentioned. They do have an international financial center. So I think that already answers the question, in that in many instances, because of the kind of relaxed regulations that you find in these centers, and you'll find these relaxed regulations for the purpose of attracting investment, that a lot of these places are actually tax havens. They have very low taxes, in fact, 0% or just no income taxes at all. And you'll find that investors aren't even using these international financial centers for any substantive investment. They're simply using them in order to benefit from the preferential tax regime. For instance, Kenya recently, as well as Zambia and Senegal, actually had to review the taxation agreements that they had with Mauritius, because they realized that a lot of investors who are investing in their own countries were rooting their investments there in order to take advantage of the low taxes and the taxation agreements that exist between Mauritius and their countries. So in a lot of ways, I do believe that international financial centers are almost equal to tax havens, or what we call secrecy jurisdictions. Another example that I can give is the British Virgin Islands and also the Cayman. I have so many examples. I could literally give you examples for 30 minutes straight. But the British Virgin Islands was specifically very prominent in the Pandora Papers. And if we look at the details of the leak, we'll find that only these documents which were leaked were found from only 14 professional bodies that are set up in the British Virgin Islands and other offshore centers, only 14. So imagine that level of leak, which was actually said to be one of the biggest exposés in terms of international financial flows. And one of the biggest exposes in terms of people hiding their money, being involved in money laundering, and gaining their money in illicit ways and hiding it, and also using it for illicit purposes. So imagine that was just a few named international financial centers, or we can also call them tax havens. Imagine setting that up in African countries, and imagine the kind of net effect that it has on the countries that will have some sort of economic relations with it. For instance, in Mauritius's case, there was a particular time that the former President Barack Obama, he was speaking about the Cayman Islands, and he said that there were over 10,000 companies registered to one address. So we can clearly see that international financial centers, or what I prefer to call offshore financial centers, really offer very little economic value if you think about it. And this is also within the background of the fact that the World Bank Ease of Doing Business Index has been debunked as having inaccuracies and being false in certain accounts. So it means that as African countries, as we're setting up international financial centers or offshore financial centers or whatever we may be, we really do need to consider the risks. And we need to be very honest about it, because there are real life examples of the harm that is being caused to this by these international financial centers, specifically not to their country, but to the surrounding countries that have economic relations with them. And as Alvin put it, in the East African region right now, we're having 2 international financial centers being set up. And as much as these 2 countries would like to argue that they can exercise tax sovereignty, that they have a right to do whatever it takes to attract investment and development into their own countries, it has been proven before, and it keeps being proven, that there's a negative net effect that these international financial centers do have. And so it's a matter of also the East African community bodies questioning this and holding them to account, because in essence, what they're doing is that they are gaining a comparative advantage. And yet, as Alvin said, we're trying to set up a common market. In fact, we're trying to set up a monetary union that is supposed to take effect. The monetary union protocol was supposed to take effect from this year. So are we taking steps back by setting up international financial centers is a question that I think as regions and as specific countries, we really need to ask.
What could be the solution? How can we make 2022 any different from what we've seen in 2021? Even, just a little bit a hint on that global tax deal and why African countries should also shy away from it.
Thank you. I think that, of course, the journey is long. I don't think that there's going to be some magic in 2022 that will do away with the tax havens or with the addressing illicit financial flows. But I think that the journey has started. We see what I always say is that the wall of secrecy has started showing cracks. The works that organizations such as ICIJ have done have really started causing cracks on this world financial system, exposing how outdated it is, how not fit for purpose it is. And I'm hoping that in the next, as we approach 2022, this kind of work is gonna continue. Of course, the work around the global minimum tax, which, as you know, TJNA has been very much opposed to, is going to come now to national level for debate at the national level. And we at the Taxes Network Africa, that's going to be one of our key planks in terms of encouraging or discouraging governments not to be party to that, because we feel that the global minimum tax by definition is going to lead to even a race at the bottom, because averagely many of the African countries have their corporate income tax at 25. Immediately they set it at 15, means that they are severely limited in their ability to collect corporate income tax, which really comparatively in the continent, in the world, Africa has got the highest the heaviest reliance on corporate income tax. So I think there's a lot of work ahead of us. We have seen some successes. I think some of the works that we have seen over the last years, we have a court case going on, as you might know, in Kenya about the double tax agreements that Kenya signed over the last couple of years. So there's a lot to expect in this space going forward, but I'm optimistic and hopeful that we're going to see even more tremendous changes in this space.
Quite the optimism there, Alvin, with his closing remarks. Evelyn, as we end this conversation, it's only right that we end it with a person that helped us break the ice at the beginning. How do you think, or what do you think should be done to help us move towards the right direction in 2022?
I think one of the things that the global minimum tax deal showed us is that as African countries, we really need a common approach, because only 2 African countries did not endorse the deal, that is specifically Kenya and Nigeria. I think we need to start building that solidarity, and I know there's a lot of work that is already going on in building that solidarity, but I think we need to further strengthen it, especially at a continental level through the African Union, so that whenever we are at a table and as several African countries, we are bargaining for our taxing rights, we are bargaining for pretty much the resources that we need in order to achieve the development that we talk about by 2063, and also, of course, the Sustainable Development Goals. We have a common approach that suits African countries specifically, because the global minimum tax deal definitely did not suit African countries. When you have a global minimum tax rate of 15%, and yet the average corporate income tax rates in African countries ranges between 25% to 30%, then it really beats logic why, the numbers speak for themselves. It really beats logic why, as African countries, we would accept it, and yet we rely on it heaviest. So my part in short is the need for more solidarity as we go into 2022, and that is work that Tax Justice Network Africa is heavily invested in.
Thank you for making the time, and thank you for joining us. If you want to be part of any of these conversations, you can tweet us at CNBC Africa, or you could tag me directly at The Real Quizzer. Have a great rest of your evening.